From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today, K-State's Dan O Brien is joined by K-State's Monte Vandeveer to discuss a new analysis that they've just worked up on what they're calling the price protection net for new crop corn. It includes the main mechanisms that they say might allow you corn growers to survive the major downturn in corn prices. Following then, K-State's Erick DeWolf with his latest observations on diseases affecting the Kansas wheat crop. He goes over the thought process on whether or not to apply a fungicide given the current disease situation. And later, we'll welcome back in K-State's Mary Knapp to cover Kansas agricultural weather. All this and more next on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Thanks for tuning in to Agriculture Today. Always good to have you listening. And on this Friday, we move right into the grain market scene, and we will concentrate again on the corn market eventually here because, as we talked of last week with K-State's Dan O Brien, the corn price prospects are not good and, in fact, may be tempting the loan rate at some point here. There may be some opportunities for that to improve for you producers, and we'll explain in just a moment. Dan, of course, is a grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, and along with Dan today is his counterpart in southwest Kansas, Monte Vandeveer. Monte will contribute to this corn price protection net conversation we'll have in just a second. Before we get to that, Dan, just a broad brush look at the grain markets this past week. And yesterday, the trades, by and large, ended the month of April, and a lousy month of April it was, on an uptick.
Yes, some optimism in the economy, some export sales moves. No doubt we'd see export sales likely at low prices like this, but May corn closed at 311.5, up 7. D's 337 and a quarter, up a bit. Soybeans were up 18 cents in the lead month, November to 850. November 857 3/4, up 13. Hard red winter wheat back up some, up 14 cents for May, 482, and July 488, up 11. So we've struggled so much to find anything positive in these markets that we need to celebrate and be thankful for an up day for the sake of sellers.
It's premature to say that the markets have turned a corner, but at least we're getting smatterings of encouraging news here.
Well, that's right. Part of the reason for kind of shifting gears on this to talk about corn and the broader safety net is because, as KSU have looked at the numbers here of late, prices well below $3. They're hitting, your 250, 230. The national loan rate is at 220. So as I was going through that, I just felt responsible out of KSU that we should not just use the loan rate as the only issue we're looking at, but to try to piece together the price loss coverage on the one hand, what crop insurance is offering us as well, and also take a quick look at current forward contracts just to see what type of net level of coverage do we have above those loan rate bottoms if we end up with that outcome come fall of 2020.
And that's why you and Monte have collaborated on this write-up, which in fact is at the agmanager.info website for reference for producers here. Let's bring in Monte to talk of the first of this multi-pronged net structure, corn revenue protection insurance, which producers could certainly benefit from in this scenario. Could they not, Monte?
Right. If we're thinking about maybe these worst case price outcomes here, we can just take a look at the price protection provided by revenue insurance. Of course, revenue insurance protects both price and yield losses. But if we're looking at a real big price decline here, then we could actually see the insurance kick in just as a result of falling prices. The projected price this year for corn, the insurance prices are based on the December corn futures contract. And the price at sign-up time in the spring is called the projected price. And that's the December corn average price over the month of February. And that came in at $3.88. So the exercise we have then is seeing then how far would price have to drop before the insurance would kick in from that base price of $3.88.
If I can add in, Monty, too, that our emeritus colleague, Art Barnaby, has looked at that long and hard and came up with a way to consider not just the 388, which covered the APH bushels, actual proven historic bushels that people signed up for, but then figuring out how to adjust that 388 to spread out over all the bushels in the field with the assumption you're getting the APH yields. So if a lot of people in Kansas bought 75% APH corn, and if you talk to that in a second, that'd be great. But if they bought 75% APH, then for the APH bushels, well, yeah, 388. But then for the rest of the bushels, you got 291. 291 is not where people want to get, but 291 is a lot better than 220.
Yeah. Well, the revenue guarantee, and I'll try to say that in a different way. Our revenue guarantee on crop insurance has three parts. The first part is that projected price. Remember, that's $3.88. Second part is the farmer's APH yield, your actual production history yield, your average yield. And then the third part is the guarantee level that you pick, the coverage level. And 75% coverage is the biggest category in Kansas. So if you assume that yields come in at average, what would it take to trigger a loss? It'd take a 25% price loss below that 388 projected price to trigger payment. So that magic number is about 291 per bushel, assuming yields come in at average.
When people were making their choices on March 15th, we were just at the very start of this. If we knew then what we know now, we'd have had a long, strenuous discussion about how perhaps buying up to 80 and 85% in this situation, in hindsight, that could have been a pretty good thing. But you're paying a lot of money to buy up. You'd be buying revenue coverage, almost guaranteed revenue coverage, if you had some idea that this thing was coming.
But when you consider the relief, if you can put it that way, being provided by this coverage, well, it's not going to make a producer whole by any means, but it's, Monty, certainly going to be of aid here, isn't it?
Right. Well, insurance, almost every kind has a deductible, which means the insured absorbs the first part of that loss. And so you had 75% coverage, then you absorb that first 25%. That's your deductible. But if we're looking at potentially bigger losses than that, then the price protection could be pretty important.
If I just add in, too, that by our KSU budgets, we figure cost of production, say, north central Kansas, non-irrigated for 120 bushel per acre yields. For the direct costs, the cash costs before land, $285. And out in southwest Kansas, Monty, on western Kansas, where our offices are at, $274 as a break even. So that $291, that's covering direct costs. If a person bought up to the 80% APH, then you're talking $310, and you're getting closer to covering all costs in north central. But by the time you got to southwest, you've got not just the land, but you have the irrigation system. And we don't do anybody any favors on our budgets when we say full cost is $383, because we're figuring they're going to go replace, the pump, the power unit, the center pivot at full cost. Well, a lot of people will, they don't have that type of cash barrier to jump over. So maybe their actual cost is $325, something like that. Mm-hmm. So challenging things to consider. Forward contract bids today in the Salina area, again, relevant to the north central budget, $285 break even. You've got forward contract bids on the low side at $284, on the high side $308, and that I think probably even higher than that, the way the day ended up yesterday. Southwest, $322 to $332. So you know what? By the time you look at more of a discounted full cost, even those forward contract bids at $322, $332, if you're a risk-averse person, wonder where things could go in the markets, Again, that's the loan rate out there in Garden City is 243 for corn. In Finney County, Saline County, it's at 229. So it's hard pencil pushing time to figure out, do you get aggressive in these price protection moves with the idea that we could see a tougher outcome in the fall?
Well, there are multiple moving parts in this price protection net that you've created in this write-up. And just as a parting thought here, Dan, how would you like producers to review this information and work it into their intentions as far as their risk management?
Well, it's a complicated, messy thing with different tools to help coming at different times. Right now, I think the thing to look at is just to be aware that there's a risk of a loan rate outcome, but that's out in the fall. And to be watchful of these forward contract bids we talked about. If they're hovering around up plus or minus $3 some, and to know where at least where their direct costs are. And I think that if they bought 75% APH, 80% APH, and they've got a 290 or a 310 price out there, then the knowledge of that would have something to do with how aggressive they are at forward contracting on opportunities coming up. If they know that this other coverage is there from revenue insurance, they may not feel as backed into a corner on forward contracting if they know that the revenue coverage is providing some bit of a net of safety for them.
Corn growers, have a look at it. It's entitled the U.S. Corn Price Protection Net, applied to Kansas for new crop marketing year 2021. It's now available to you at agmanager.info. Thanks for going to the trouble of working this up, gentlemen, and we appreciate your time. Take care, Dan. Monty?
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
Along with us for this week's special edition of the Grain Market segment, Dan O Brien and Monte Vandeveer, agricultural economists, K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today returns with more in a moment on the K-State Radio Network.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Agriculture Today returns now, keeping tabs on the winter wheat crop in Kansas once more. It's had its trials and tribulations already with freeze damage to part of the crop, and we'll be hearing more about that. At the same time, we have the inevitable disease threats to the crop that tend to show up at this point in the springtime. So for an update on that angle, we bring back by once more K-State plant pathologist Erick DeWolf. And Eric, there are complicating factors with the cold temperatures of a couple of weeks back, which we'll get into in just a second. But as you're hearing and seeing reports from the field now, what is going on out there in the wheat disease sense?
Right. So me and my colleagues have been out a lot trying to evaluate freeze. And while we're doing that, we're also checking for disease issues as well. So we've visited many areas of the state now, in addition to talking to growers and crop consultants, ag industry representatives. So we feel like we've got a pretty good handle on at least the preliminary assessment of what's going on. So far, it seems like overall, I would say the disease level is still at low levels relative to other years, but there are some signs of potential change that we need to keep an eye on here. Probably most notably, there was a report of stripe rust in 3 different counties in south central Kansas, including Sedgwick, Reno, and Pratt County. And now, right now, the disease is still at very low levels, still in the mid-canopy. So not an imminent threat, but we're right there at the critical growth stages where growers will have to evaluate potential fungicide options. Other diseases to keep an eye out for would be some of the septoria complex of leaf spotting diseases. Seems like that disease has been on the move the last 3 years, and it looks like this year is setting up to also be an at least average to maybe even above average year for some leaf spotting diseases in some parts of the state.
As per the rust issue, and you wrote a column on this in the one of the recent e-update newsletters, you gave some tips on producers scouting for stripe rust in particular here, and you might share that information so as producers go out, they have a better handle on what they're looking for.
Sure, absolutely. It's always a little bit of a challenge to describe on the radio what the disease symptoms look like, but there are pictures available through K-State Research and Extension. Has a number of publications about identifying wheat diseases. In general, with stripe rust, leaf rust, we're looking for these small, either bright orange in the case of stripe rust or leaf rust, a little more brick red type of lesion. As the name implies, stripe rust tends to occur in these little bit longer stripes or rectangular shaped lesions. And leaf rust, more of a pinprick size lesion, about the size of a head of a pin. So very tiny in their early stages of development. The leaf spot diseases are often brown spots, tan spots surrounded with a thin yellow, or what we describe as chlorotic halo, meaning that the chlorophyll, the green pigments of the plants are starting to break down. One of the other tips for scouting this time of year would be to look at the lower to mid canopy. So we mentioned that's where rust is showing up this time of year. And part of what's going on there is the crop begins to grow and approaches the flag leaf emergent stages of growth. The plants are putting on new foliage or new leaves very rapidly, roughly a new leaf every 7 to 10 days. And given that a disease like stripe rust might take 2 weeks or so before you would see any symptoms from the time the infection takes place to the time of the symptom expression, it's usually best to look in the lower mid-canopy just because that's where the disease has had enough time on the developing crop to develop symptoms that would be visible at this stage in the growth.
Now, the question that arises, given that concern over freeze injury to wheat, is will that injury open up the plant for more intense disease damage in the case of the rusts or septoria or any other pathogen?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's the thinking there?
Well, yeah, so there's a couple different ways that the potential for freeze injury here affects the diseases, and maybe even more importantly, disease management decisions. So from one perspective, a disease like rust that requires a living leaf tissue in order to survive, if there was a lot of leaf injury, like it looks like there was in many areas of the state, if there was lesions on that leaf tissue, the rust would be also knocked back by that kind of leaf burning or almost scorching type of appearance that frost damage causes to the foliage. So we may have lost some of our rust there, but it's unlikely that we'd completely eliminate it. The other factor here is that in wheat that was hit particularly hard by the freeze, we may see the plants producing a lot of new tillers. And as the wheat stools out here and tries to recover, the growth stage relative to other years will be set back. And oftentimes that disease, like stripe rust, like leaf rust, will have a few extra weeks or maybe another 10 days to build up and to get established earlier relative to the grain filling period when our wheat really becomes vulnerable to these different diseases. So that delay in growth, balanced with some of the potential loss of these different diseases just because of the leaf injury, ultimately influences part of the disease level that we'll see this year.
It's really difficult, though, to parse out what's going on with the double whammy here, if you will, disease and freeze damage to the wheat, and then come up with a sensible plan for responding to it in the form of a fungicide application. Any insight you can lend to a producer on how to sort all of that out, Eric?
Well, so let me give you a few thoughts here. I think from my perspective, as I work with growers all over the state, there's really a continuum of growers' willingness or interest in using fungicides. Some growers plan on using a fungicide every year, really no matter what they see. They just plan for it, budget for it, and they're going to do it. Other growers are very reluctant to use fungicides for a variety of different reasons. But maybe another 50% or so of the growers are kind of opportunistic in the way they look at fungicides. If they see a threat emerging and they look like they've got good yield potential, they'll go ahead and use a fungicide to help maintain that yield potential. And I guess the way I often approach it would be evaluate the yield potential of your crop here. Anything that's threatening that yield potential should give you reason to pause and gather additional information about whether you should apply a fungicide. And in this case, it's freeze damage or potential for freeze damage. Take some time to evaluate your wheat over the next week or so. Will be particularly critical to evaluate what percentage of tillers are lost. Are we seeing whiteheads emerge or evidence that tillers have been aborted because of freeze damage to the growing point? Fields that look like they really got knocked back and the yield potential is considerably lower than what we were originally estimating based on the crop. We might be a little more cautious with the inputs that we're putting into that crop as well. So, if we look at the price of wheat, in addition to that, the yield potential and the cost of the inputs, do a little research locally to see what the different fungicide options application costs would pencil out to be and see if it makes sense for you. If you're looking at the average yield response for a fungicide, remember long-term the K-State research data would suggest on average it's right around 10%. There's considerable variability around that, but that would be the long-term type of average. So you can use that as a part of your calculation too. And that, remember, is going to be directly linked to the yield potential. So if you have a 80 bushel yield potential, 10% average, pretty easy to calculate, would be around 8 bushel type of yield response. If that drops down to 60 or 40 or maybe even lower in some extreme cases, the math, it goes pretty straightforward down from 6 to 4 to 2 maybe type of yield response. And that is going to play into the balance sheet here as we seek to evaluate the value and potential merits of applying a fungicide.
So contemplating all of this, but it does start with identifying that yield potential. We would bring up that your colleague Romolo Lalato in the previous E-Update newsletter out of K-State Agronomy this past Friday did get into some detail on assessing that freeze damage to wheat for said yield potential. So have a look at that, producers. And lastly, before we let you go, Eric, we've talked about the rust diseases, septoria. As you look ahead, any other pathogens that might assert themselves as conditions are shaping up currently?
Well, I think we always want to try and keep our eye out for diseases like Fusarium head blight or head scab. As our wheat in the southeast portion of the state reaches the heading and flowering stages of growth here over the next week to 10 days, I think we want to keep an eye on that disease that, remember, infects right around those flowering stages of growth. So if we get into a rainy period, it would be prudent to be keeping an eye out and for the potential need for fungicides there as well.
It is, in a disease management sense, quickly entering crunch time for our winter wheat growers in Kansas, and with all of these mitigating factors lending to the difficulty of that decision. But this input is helpful in knowing how to go there, Eric, and thanks for your time.
You're welcome.
Erick DeWolf is a plant pathologist at Kansas State University. And those comments on disease threats to Kansas winter wheat on this part of Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here as we move on now to today's agricultural news headlines. These courtesy in part of DTN. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue said yesterday that some idled meatpacking plants could start operating again in days, not weeks, as the USDA works to implement the executive order from President Trump. Perdue said the USDA is working with the Centers for Disease Control and Occupational Safety and Health Administration to implement worker safety guidelines at packing plants. Perdue said employee safety and health are a primary goal. House Agriculture Committee Chairman Colin Peterson, meanwhile, had said this week that the Secretary wants to ensure that 3 major pork plants reopen quickly, those being JBS in Worthington, Minnesota, Smithfield Foods in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Tyson Foods in Waterloo, Iowa. Hog slaughter numbers continue to decline daily. The USDA reports show packers processed 271,000 head of hogs on Wednesday. That was down from 471,000 the same day last year. That puts production at roughly 58% compared to a year ago. Now, in Grand Island, Nebraska, Mayor Roger Steele wrote the Secretary a letter about the situation with the JBS beef plant that employs about 3,600 people there. The area around Grand Island has more than 1,000 cases of COVID and has had at least 35 fatalities from the virus, including 10 deaths yesterday. In a press conference yesterday, Steele said the president's order confirms what we already knew, in his words, that the JBS plant is critical infrastructure. Steele noted that JBS has taken steps to increase worker safety, but that Grand Island also has an infection rate 16 times higher than the rest of the state of Nebraska. Also in Nebraska, Tyson Foods announced it would temporarily halt production at its beef facility in Dakota City until this coming Monday for a deep cleaning at that plant. And Tyson announced yesterday it's partnering with a medical clinic company, Matrix Medical Network by name, to provide on-site health care service at some of its facilities in Iowa, Indiana, and Washington State. Once Tyson reopens the plants, Matrix will test workers for COVID and provide other screening practices for workers as well. Tyson stated additional clinics will be set up at other Tyson facilities as needed. According to the latest USDA numbers, both crop and livestock producers as a whole saw month-over-month increases in prices received for their commodities during March, which may well come as a surprise in the wake of the COVID impact. Here's more from the USDA's Rod Bain.
USDA's March Prices Received Index for ag producers indicates they received more price-wise for their commodities compared to the previous month. The overall price received index rose just over 3% month-over-month, the same percentage jump noted in the March crop production index, while livestock producers received almost 3% more price-wise for their products during the same time period. Produce farmers noticed the most significant increase in their prices month-over-month in the 9.5% to almost 10% range. That, and a slight increase in prices received for wheat and feed grains, offset declines in what growers receive for prices for corn, soybeans, and other crops like hay. In the livestock index, poultry and egg growers saw a 22% increase in prices received for their commodities. That countered monthly declines in both meat animal and dairy prices. Meanwhile, producers paid less in total for goods and services in March, almost 1% less, due to lower prices for feeder cattle and hogs, and field crops, which offset increases in what producers paid for fertilizers, nutrients, and supplements. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Several consecutive nights of sub-freezing temperatures in mid-April raised immediate concerns about the Kansas winter wheat crop, and over the 2 weeks since, the extent of the freeze damage has become more clear, and the prognosis leaves something to be desired, to say the least. Marcia Boswell has more on that on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
The condition of the U.S. hard red winter wheat crop is not improving. Farmers and the markets are concerned about the threats to yield potential from widespread April freezes and increasing dryness across a significant portion of the central and southern Great Plains. USDA's most recent crop condition ratings reflect the weather effects on the 2021 winter wheat crop, reducing the total crop rated good to excellent from 62% to 57%. According to Romulo Lolato, K-State Wheat and Forages Extension Specialist, drought weakens winter wheat's ability to recover from freeze damage, and both conditions challenge winter wheat yield potential. So the change in ratings is focused on the hard red winter wheat crop based on the worsening dryness in north central and southwestern Kansas, eastern Colorado, and south central Nebraska. Between April 20th and 27th, USDA reduced its Kansas winter wheat rating from 46% good to excellent to 40% as localized freezes and expanding dryness threaten crop progress. Lolato says about 50 to 60% of the state's wheat was impacted to varying degrees by freeze damage. In north central Kansas, several counties showed varying but considerable freeze damage. According to researchers at K-State, the crop in that region needs moisture soon to help with freeze damage recovery. In parts of central Kansas, late sown fields following a soybean crop showed severe leaf and tiller damage from recent freeze events. In parts of northwest Kansas, dry soil conditions predisposed plants to freeze damage, and in some cases, severely damaged fields turned yellow and brown as plant tissue deteriorated. Southwest Kansas is still extremely dry, and that could impact the crop's ability to recover from freeze damage. Looking ahead, hot, dry temperatures across the state could further challenge the crop's ability to recover. In Colorado, moderate to severe drought plagues the eastern third of the state where winter wheat is grown. Looking ahead, high temperatures and no moisture in eastern Colorado could continue to pressure the state's yield potential. Several weeks ago, USDA rated 54% of Colorado's winter wheat in good to excellent condition, but as of April 27th, only 37% of the state's crop is in the top condition. Hard red winter wheat conditions in Nebraska are better than Kansas and Colorado, with 69% of the crop rated good to excellent. Freezing temperatures in Nebraska's southern panhandle and southwest Nebraska burned back the wheat and slowed its growth. Adequate soil moisture levels and warmer temperatures in the western part of the state are expected to help the crop recover from recent freezes. Reports from Oklahoma show significant freeze damage in some of the state's southwest and south central counties. Some counties in southwestern Oklahoma reported freeze damage across 40 to 70% of the crop. In several extreme cases, some areas in south central Oklahoma showed freeze damage in virtually every field. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And by the way, the very latest from K-State's Ramalolo Lotto on the status of the Kansas wheat crop will be out in the new Agronomy e-Update newsletter, coming out later this afternoon, agronomy.ksu.edu. This is Agriculture Today.
When a thunderstorm approaches, follow these safety tips. Lightning, known as the underrated killer, usually strikes the tallest objects, so avoid standing beneath trees or other isolated tall objects. Take shelter in a sturdy building. Remember, if you're close enough to hear thunder, you're close enough to be struck by lightning. Help keep you and your family safe this severe weather season. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Now for you on Agriculture Today, the very latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State, as Mary Knapp is along with us once more, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. Starting with Mary, if we might, the moisture recap for the past several days, and the dryness has intensified in those areas of Kansas which have been really needing relief for a while.
Right. Our big loser, if you want to call it that, would be in northwest Kansas. They had a very dry week. Their average for the week was less than 10% of normal. And the western divisions continued that trend. West Central was a little bit better, but Southwest, which was the best of the western divisions, only had 3/4 of their normal weekly precipitation. So you can imagine that really didn't do much to improve the monthly totals either. In contrast, that southeastern corner can't get a break. They continued with another round of wetter than normal conditions, again pushing that wet pattern that they've seen for the last year and a half, actually.
So as the drought monitor would dictate it, we have extreme drought in parts of Kansas and severe dryness elsewhere in the state?
Right. What we have is abnormally dry conditions. That showed up on the map in north central Kansas last week. And basically what they've done is filled in that entire northwest section, matching up with the dryness in the west central and southwest division. They haven't moved into exceptional drought in the southwest area yet, but that continued below normal is going to push those barriers, especially as we move into the warmer patterns that we're expecting in the next couple of weeks. The fact that we were cooler than normal for the previous week and have been cooler than normal for April overall has lessened somewhat the impact of the dry conditions. But again, as we move into our summer weather pattern, things are going to go downhill very, very quickly.
And this dryness in those areas where we're now seeing confirmation of serious freeze damage to the winter wheat crop, well, this is doing very little to alleviate that issue with that crop.
Right, and they're especially noting that, again, you look in the northwest area where the crop was not quite as advanced as some of the other regions, but the rooting system is fairly limited. There is subsoil moisture in the region, but if the roots can't get down to it, they're not going to benefit from it. So they could really use a fairly substantial rain event. And fortunately, it looks like there might be something in the offing in the next couple of days for that area.
And we'll get into that as we talk of the weekend forecast. On something of a side note here, in the severe weather category, oddly enough, we're now into the month of May. April is behind us, and Kansas has yet to confirm a tornado in the state. And that doesn't happen very often.
Right. We've matched the start date of 2018, which was one of our later starts, and that first tornado was on May 1st. We have to go back to 1967 for a later, and that was the latest date for the start to the tornado season, and that was on May 26th. Our earliest start, we can go back to 2006, where we had 3 tornadoes in January, so it can be all over the board. It doesn't necessarily indicate a slow tornado season either. And there will be an article in the Agronomy e-update today that kind of covers that topic. If people are interested, they can find out more details. We should also note that lack of tornadoes has not meant lack of severe weather. We've had a number of hail events, some of them that were pretty impressive, not so much because of the size of the hail, but as the quantity, where you're talking about swaths of hail several inches deep that cover a couple of miles. Greensburg had one in the middle of the month. Last week, there was one up in northern Pot County. So again, there has been some hail to further try our spring crop season.
We haven't been scot-free as far as severe weather. And as we look then to the immediate forecast, warmer temperatures today to the extent that records might be tested in some parts of Kansas.
Right. We are looking at warm up out in western Kansas. We're looking at some highs that are reaching into the 90s. Here in Manhattan, our record high for today is 91. Then the cold front comes through. That's expected to trigger some showers in northwest, possibly in north central Kansas. Another chance of showers both Sunday and Monday. And then temperatures moderate. We're looking at highs in the upper 70s, low 80s before we move into the full part of the week. But overall, the pattern for the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlook is for drier than normal conditions. So it's not really going to help that wheat recovery. And areas that miss out on these weekend rains are going to go downhill pretty quickly.
So you're saying that, as you cite it frequently, quantitative precipitation index is suggesting moisture on the light side the next few days.
Right. The quantitative precip forecast does favor some fairly beneficial rains in the northern areas of the state. Northwest Kansas may see as much as an inch, which would be very, very welcome. But you move out of that northern boundary region and you drop off fairly quickly. So you get into central Kansas, northeastern Kansas, they're looking more on the neighborhood of a quarter to a half an inch. And if you get down into southwest Kansas, they're looking at maybe a tenth to a quarter of an inch, not, again, a very impressive amount. Should note that there is still that pattern for southeast Kansas to be in those heavier rainfall amounts too. So it's kind of like they can't buy a break from their wet conditions.
All right, then. Thanks for the latest. And next Friday, we'll visit once more. Have a good weekend, Mary.
Thanks, Eric, and you as well.
Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. And that is our time for today and for the week. Again, thanks to you for being along with us, and do enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.